Like Amanda said, my name's Lucy and I'm one of the dietitians over at Great Ormond Street, and I actually lead up the GI allergy service there. And my talk's going to be looking at the practical management of diets for eosinophilic esophagitis, or EoE as we all know it now after these 4 weeks of education sessions. And it's going to kind of continue on from what Karen went through in her talk a couple of weeks ago. So around a little bit more in depth about the diets and how we might manage them from a dietetic perspective. So the objectives of today's session are to be aware of what diets are used in EoE and key nutrients that can be affected by these diets, what suitable alternatives there are for these exclusion diets, to understand if nutritional supplements are required in EoE or when they should be used and when not, understanding how to look at the food labels to check out if any of these foods are included in anything that you're eating or your child's eating, and some top tips around eating out, traveling, food preparation, and actually some information around the pandemic as well. But hopefully that's all coming to an end soon enough, fingers crossed. And then just briefly at the end, how we might go about reintroducing food after the period of exclusion, and just some useful resources and websites that you guys might find helpful. So as Karen kind of explained a couple of weeks ago, there's, I suppose, 4 main diets that we use to manage EoE. So you've got your 2 food exclusion diets, which is milk on dairy-based products and wheat. 4 food elimination diets, so your milk and dairy, egg, wheat, and soya. 6 food, which is milk and dairy, egg, wheat, soya, all kind of nuts, so tree and peanuts, and then all kinds of fish, so fish and shellfish. And then lastly, we have the elemental diet, which is a liquid-based formula that's an amino acid formula, so the tiny building blocks of proteins. And that's given as a sole source of nutrition for a set period of time to induce remission in the disease. So what we want to know really is the aims of dietary treatment in EoE. So we want to avoid the trigger foods or the suspected trigger foods, depending on the patient. Replace those with suitable alternatives that are going to give enough macro and micronutrients. Obviously induce remission of disease, so bring down the eosinophil count to less than the 15 per high power field, and hopefully improve symptoms. So I know Karen explained previously that disease activity and symptoms do not correlate. So it might see even with disease in complete remission, a patient still has symptoms. So we can't guarantee that with the dietary manipulations, but it's something that we would hope to improve for a patient. So looking at that list of diets, they obviously can be quite restrictive, or very, very restrictive actually, especially if we think of a 6 food exclusion diet. And these are some of the key nutrients that can be missing or can be limited when you're on those exclusion diets. So protein, for example, if you're cutting out your milk or your eggs, soya, nuts and fish, all of them, that really does affect the protein intake, especially if someone was following, a vegan or vegetarian based diet. And protein is really important for sort of growth and development as a child is getting older. Calcium is something that we look quite closely at when we're removing milk from the diet, and especially some of the nuts as well. And the calcium is really important for your bone health, teeth health, and cardiac health as well. So we want to make sure, especially in a growing child, that there's enough calcium in the diet to make sure that's not being leached from the bones. You've got other micronutrients, so your zinc and your selenium, your B vitamins, etc., that are really important for sort of general immunity, cognitive function, wound healing, all those types of things. So removing these foods from the diet can really impact the nutrition for a patient. And our aim as dietitians is to be able to support you to make sure that the diet is balanced. And another key thing, I forgot to mention this, is the fiber that you get from specifically kind of wheat and soya and some of the nuts as well. And that's really important for, your gut microbiome and gut health, and also keeping the bowels moving so you're not getting constipated. So if we start off with milk, we'll kind of work through each of the food groups systematically to get a little bit more of an understanding. So milk and dairy, actually, compared to maybe what it was even 5 years ago, there's a really big variety of different plant-based milks on the diet. In the market, sorry. You've got your rice milk, which is not suitable for under around age 4.5, and that's just because it's got a high arsenic content, but it is an option for an older child. You've got your oat milk, and actually for EoE, we normally advise that Oatly is probably one of the only suitable brands, and that's just because it has such a low gluten content to it. Obviously, you've got your soya-based alternatives, which are a great choice in terms of protein, but only suitable on the 2 food exclusion diet. You've got your coconut, hemp, and nut milks. And again, the nut milks are not suitable on the 6 food exclusion diet. And you've got your pea milk as well, which is probably quite new to the market compared to some of the others. So there's a whole host of different ones. They come in chocolate flavor, they come sweetened, they come unsweetened. So there's a variety to have a try with and see how your child likes them. What's important though is to make sure that you're opting for the non-organic products. So the organic products don't have any supplementation or additions to them. So we want to look for the milks that have some calcium added to them, some iodine added, and some actually have some vitamin D. So it's really important not to opt for the organic in this case. So I've just put in this table because I thought it was quite interesting to have a look at how nutrition differs amongst these plant-based milks. So in semi-skimmed cow's milk, you've got around 50 calories per 100 mils and around 3.6 grams of protein. But as you can see, some of the other milks, so the coconut milk, which would be suitable on a full 6 food exclusion diet, because coconut doesn't count as a nut, only has 20 calories per 100 mils. And again, only about 0.1 grams of protein. So actually very, very low in protein compared to cow's milk. That is something to consider, especially depending on the age of your child, if they're having a sort of a plant-based milk as an alternative, and just making sure they're getting enough protein in their diet in other sources if if they are opting for one of the sort of the lower protein milks here. And obviously if weight is a concern, which it can be sometimes in EoE, then opting for one that's slightly higher in energy is always advisable, because it's going to help with weight gain. So I mentioned the pea milks before, and actually these would be suitable on the 6 food exclusion diet, or the 4 or the 2, any of those would be fine. Still relatively low in calories, only about 32 calories per 100 mils, similar to skimmed milk, but it does have around 3.3 grams of protein. And actually these are fortified up much higher than even cow's milk, so 186 milligrams of calcium per 100 ml portion. So if you're struggling for calcium, these can be quite a handy tool to use in cooking and things like that. This is just some examples of various different products that you can get that are plant-based, which can make the diet feel a little bit more normal for your child. So there's lots of yogurts and desserts available, and some of the brands are here. Again, not all of these are fortified with calcium. So your cocoa yogurt is fortified with calcium, but many of the others aren't. The Oatly yogurt and desserts and things like that are really good. There's a custard. There's now yogurts in Greek style and different flavors. You also have got your sort of almond milk based yogurts as well. Again, there's loads of different cheeses on the market. Again, not all of these will be suitable on all of the exclusion diets, but depending on what level of exclusion your child is following, there's a real variety that can be bought. So there's the BioLife and there's cocoa, which are coconut milk based. The cocoa is fortified with calcium, and actually there's another brand which I've not written on there, which is Vitalite, which is also fortified with calcium. You've got your soya based cheeses, and often they do kind of like a mozzarella stick style, some of them, so they're quite nice if you're having a party and things like that, and you can have soya as part of the diet. You've got your cheese-based your pea-based cheeses, and obviously your nut-based cheeses as well. And something that can be really helpful when you're thinking of cheese, or you're wanting a cheesy sauce, or you're making cheesy muffins or something like that, is using a little bit of nutritional yeast in the recipe. This has quite a cheesy flavor and can kind of give it that kind of salty, cheesy flavor that you might miss when you're not having sort of cheddar or parmesan or whatever the other types of cheeses are you usually enjoy. And then obviously creams and ice creams, you know, it's nice to have some desserts as part of the diet. And just because your child's on an exclusion diet doesn't mean that they can't have some nice things that maybe their brothers and sisters have, or you guys have, you know, on a special occasion. So the vegan magnums go down quite well. Just double check you're not picking the almond ones if your child is on a 6 food exclusion diet. But you've also got different various ice creams. So your oat-based ice cream or your oat-based creme fraiche, and lots of coconut milk-based ice creams as well. You can also use, most sorbets are suitable, so it doesn't even have to be a specialized product, but just double check, because some of them do sometimes have a little bit of kind of milk powder in them, but most sorbets should be okay. And then you've got different butters that can be used in cooking or spread on toast or in a sandwich, however you'd like to use them. And here's just some, I suppose, just some different photos of different brands, just to know what you're looking for. It can be a bit daunting when you're starting out on this diet, and actually knowing what you're looking for in the supermarket is can be a little bit scary. So these are just some of the common brands, and the ones with the star next to them are the ones that are fortified with calcium. You can see I put Bird's Original Custard Powder on there. Obviously, that's not a plant-based alternative, but it's actually free from all of the foods on the 6 food exclusion diet, and you can use your normal plant-based milk to make a custard up with that to make a trifle, or, you know, whatever it was that you wanted to make. Okay, so then we move on to eggs. So avoiding eggs in their normal form, you know, fried eggs, scrambled eggs, omelettes, etc., is relatively easy. You just don't make that food with the egg in it. But there's also egg that's used a lot in cooking. It's used a lot as a stabilizer in foods and added into things that we might not even think about having egg. And the other big thing that it's used in is obviously baking. And we wouldn't want, you know, anyone to be missing out on some of these treats. So baking or pancakes or, you know, whatever it was they enjoyed. So these are some examples that can be used, in natural examples, rather than using an egg replacer that you can buy in, you know, your health food shops or in the supermarkets. So you can make something called a chia egg or a flax egg. And this is with 1 tablespoon of sort of milled chia seeds or flax seeds with 3 tablespoons of water. Leave that, mix that up, leave that to rest for, you know, 5 minutes or so. It kind of makes this gloopy, gooey texture. And that would be equivalent to 1 egg in a recipe. So that's quite a good one. And it adds a little bit of fiber into the diet as well, which is always helpful. You've got your aquafaba, which is the water that's found in chickpeas. And this can be used as kind of a substitute for egg. Around 3 tablespoons is equivalent to 1 egg. You can also whisk it up. So whisk it like you would an egg to make meringue. Add some sugar in there, and you can actually bake and make meringues or meringue pie with that, or, you know, any of those things. And also really fluffy pancakes. So that's quite a good one to have an experiment with if you've not tried yet. And with a little bit of sugar, it kind of takes away that taste of the chickpeas. And then you've got kind of mashed fruit. So generally sort of pureed apple or apple sauce, or mashed banana, and that would be equivalent to around 1 egg as well. In the next table, some of these foods wouldn't be suitable on the sort of the 4 and the 6 food exclusion diet, but it is something to bear in mind if you're on kind of one of the other diets. You might be able to use the nut butters on the 4 food exclusion diets as an alternative to egg. You can use your plant-based yogurt, so you could be your coconut yogurt or your oat yogurt as a replacement. And if you're on the 2 food exclusion diet, you know, if you had an egg allergy alongside, you could actually use tofu as an alternative, and that can be used like scrambled egg or similar sort of texture to that. And there's actually a new product on the market called Cracked, which is a no egg. And this can be used to make, you know, frittatas, Yorkshire puddings, can be used in baking. So it has that much more eggy texture, and if your child really enjoys like little egg muffins and things like that, then that can be a really good addition to the diet. And that is based on like a legume water, so like the chickpea water, the aquafaba. Okay, so moving on to wheat. So mostly in the UK and mostly in paediatrics, we tend to avoid wheat rather than full gluten as a starting point in EoE. And if you were to advise to avoid gluten, that would be wheat, rye, barley, and oats in most cases. Okay, so it is quite more restrictive than just avoiding the wheat, but it's always worth just double checking that with your team, so your gastroenterologist and your dietitian, to check if they want you on just a wheat-free or a full gluten-free diet. So this table kind of shows what suitable alternatives are for different products that might form a regular part of a child's diet. So you've got your cereals and grains. So you might be able to use potato flour or buckwheat flour, chickpeas or corn flour, maize, etc., as an alternative in baking. You've also got your wheat and your gluten-free wraps. So most sort of wheat-free wraps will also be gluten-free, or there are some breads as well that are free from kind of your full top 6. You've got your crackers and your crisp breads, and actually a lot of children, especially kind of the younger ones, do quite like a rice cake as a snack. Just double checking that the flavoured ones don't have any additional whey powder in or any soya or anything like that in the flavouring. So just to double check that information. You've also got your corn cakes and sort of corn tortillas for older children as well. And you've got your gluten-free oat cakes, obviously not going for the cheesy flavour for any of those exclusions. And then you've got your breakfast cereals. So the ones made from rice, so like Rice Krispies, for example, would be a suitable option. You've got your corn based as well, which would be like your cornflakes. You can get gluten-free oats and buckwheat and millet-based breakfast cereals, and actually sort of puffed quinoa as well. They're probably more in the health food shops rather than, your Tesco's or your Sainsbury's, but there are some available that, could just mix things up a little bit. You could also make, say, your own granola, for example, with some of these grains and cereals, but just by kind of spreading it out on a tray, adding a little bit of cinnamon, etc., putting some, mixing some dried fruit in at the end or some seeds, and just bake that in the oven with a little bit of honey, and that's quite a good breakfast cereal to make at home as well. And then you've got your pizzas, pastas, rice, noodles, all those things which kind of make up probably the bulk of our meals, especially kind of later on in the day, most traditional dinners. But that could be, buckwheat or corn or rice noodles. You've got your lentil-based pastas as well now, which I haven't put on there, but are, definitely suitable. And then your gluten-free pizza bases. Some of these do contain milk, so just double check that. And then obviously you've got your naturally free from wheat products. So you've got your potato and sweet potato, rice and quinoa. So there's quite a lot on the market. That doesn't necessarily mean that you have to buy specialized products. Okay, so we've spoken about kind of excluding those foods from the diet, what we could use as suitable alternatives. And I mentioned some of the key nutrients at the beginning that, we might be at risk of missing if we're, reducing these in the diet or eliminating them for a set period of time, or actually a very prolonged period of time, depending on if the disease is in remission or not. So I mentioned protein previously. So obviously in a meat eater, so in a carnivore, meats or poultry would be absolutely a great source of protein in the diet on the 6 food exclusion diet. Also some corn products, but some of these do contain soya as well, so just double check that. You've got your beans and pulses, but obviously not going for a soya-based bean and pulse, but your chickpeas or kidney beans, mixed beans, all of those are absolutely fine. The pea-based milks are a great source of protein, remember around 3.3 grams per 100 mils. And then your seeds, which also add a little bit of fiber to the diet. So chia or flax or sesame, if you don't have an IgE-mediated allergy to that. So there are ways to definitely bulk out the diet. And tahini is a great addition as well. So your B vitamins, I mentioned nutritional yeast before. So that is very high in B12. So that is something that also gives you the cheesy taste, but gives you some extra nutrition that you might miss when you're doing some of these eliminations. A lot of breakfast cereals and actually the plant-based milks are fortified with your B vitamins as well. And obviously pork if you're a meat eater. Calcium, so you can get that from, obviously, from your fortified plant-based milks and your dairy alternatives, so your yogurts and cheeses, etc. You can also get it from other sources of food. So oranges have quite a good amount of calcium in. Your fortified breakfast cereals, different broccolis, vegetables, like your green leafy veggies like broccoli, kale and greens. But the bioavailability isn't quite as good. So that basically means that the absorption in the body isn't quite as good with plant-based products, and you have to eat obviously quite a large portion to get the same amount that you would with a dairy or fortified product. So they're definitely important to keep in part of the diet, but I wouldn't just rely on those as your main source of calcium. So iodine, the main sources of iodine in our diet usually are dairy, seafood and eggs. And obviously on a 6-food exclusion diet, you're really cutting out the amount of iodine that you're having. Probably the main place that you'd get this as an alternative source would be your fortified dairy products, your fortified milk-based products, so your plant-based things. Your magnesium, you can get that from potatoes, dried fruit, dark chocolate. Again, double checking the labels on that, because a lot of them will be made in a factory where a milk-based chocolate is produced. And that's not necessarily a problem, and I'll explain that shortly. But just to double check, there's definitely none listed on the ingredient. Fiber to keep your bowels kind of nice and healthy and regular. So your fruits and veggies, and all of those are absolutely suitable on the 6-food exclusion diet. Your seeds and grains. If you're finding your child is struggling sort of with the texture of those, you can buy them kind of ground up or milled, which can be mixed into sauces and things like that if you're struggling with swallowing. And also skin on potatoes is a great addition of fiber. And then you've got your omega-3 and 6 fats. So some of your essential fatty acids, which we get from diet, mostly from sort of oily fish and from nuts as well. So if you're on a 6-food exclusion diet, using some sort of other vegetable-based oils in your cooking, or as a salad dressing, and you can get algae-based supplements as well, but you can speak to your dietitian about that, whether they feel that that's something that would be required. Okay, so supplements is probably something that me and Karen get asked about a lot. And the general rule is there isn't probably a general rule, in fact. Not all children will have to take a supplement on an exclusion diet, depending on, what they eat, if they like alternatives, if that provides enough to meet their nutritional requirements. But something we often do struggle to get the enough in of is calcium, and vitamin D is something that definitely needs to be supplemented in the diet, and that's general government guidelines, and that everyone should have around 10 micrograms of vitamin D during the winter months. But actually, I would take that all year round. We don't get that much sunshine here in the UK, and who knows when we're going to be allowed to go on holiday again. So taking that daily is really, really important. So like I say, it can be difficult to get on an exclusion diet, especially for sort of the teenagers and adolescents. The requirements are quite high, between 800 and 1,000 milligrams a day, which can be difficult to get from, plant-based foods or additions in the diet. Here's some examples of how you might be able to get it in for a younger child, so age sort of 1 to 3 years. Some of these children might be still having a little bit of, amino acid formula alongside, or drinking maybe more volume of sort of a plant-based milk, because that kind of is part of a diet for a younger child. But for example, if you had 2 slices of fortified toast with around 100 grams of baked beans, you'd reach around a 350 milligram intake of calcium in a day. So that's not that difficult to get. And other ways that can be done, so you've got some plant-based milk with a fortified breakfast cereal with 1 orange, or maybe a glass of orange juice, and again that would get around your 360 milligrams in. So it is possible, but it's always worth running through your diet or your child's diet with your dietitian, just to check that they are having enough. If you don't have access to the dietitian, just trying to tot it up, roughly on a piece of paper is a good way just to double check that. So checking labels. So one of the key things with EoE and being able to manage it is to be able to kind of look at a food label and understand what that information is. So by law in the EU, we have to have all common food allergens labelled, okay? And that is all foods that contain that as an ingredient or that's used in a processing aid. It has to be declared at the point of sale. And also any foods that packaged should have that information on it. Now it is also the law that any sort of, croissants or etc. that you might get from a delicatessen, and you can get, your vegan croissants, they should say what allergens they've got as part of it. And that would be the same if you were, at a sort of a quick lunch place where you might grab like a sandwich or a salad that's pre-made. That should have your allergen information on it. The laws are slightly different when you're traveling outside the EU. So I'll give some sort of top tips around traveling on exclusion diets shortly. But it might not be labelled quite as clearly as what we see here in the EU. So that is always something to bear in mind if you're off somewhere, far, far away on a holiday, being able to understand what those food labels tell you or how you can get that information. And the information should be really easy to pick out. It should be highlighted in bold or it should be underlined. So you shouldn't really miss it, but sometimes it is still a little bit tricky. And the NHS website has some really good information about checking checking labels, sorry. So if you're struggling, then it's always worth just having a look at that website just to point you in the right direction if you're still struggling looking at the labels and understanding what they say. So here's a little example of a label that might be part of your normal family diet. So if someone's birthday, you bought a lovely cake and you will want to celebrate. So this would be a typical label that you might see on the back of that type of product. And as you can see, many of the foods here or the allergens are highlighted in bold. So they're really easy to pick out at a sort of a first glance. You might notice that some of them have some other names. So whey powder is also a word for milk. And I'll go through that shortly as well. Just want to point out, you see here it says soya lecithin. So actually soya lecithin is kind of an emulsifier that's used a lot in cooking. And in EoE, we do allow soya lecithin as part of the diet because it doesn't actually contain any of the soya protein. And it's the protein that triggers the eosinophils to kind of be present in the esophagus. So if something says soya lecithin, but doesn't have soya just as an ingredient, then that can definitely be included in the diet. This can be a little bit more tricky to kind of pick out because you just see this word soya in bold and then you think, oh, I definitely can't eat that. So it's always worth double checking those soya containing foods. And I mentioned before about kind of in a factory with or may contain. And actually on EoE, we don't advise that you need to avoid products that say may contain or made in a factory with. Because again, the amount that it potentially is present in these products is so minimal, we wouldn't expect it to be triggering the eosinophils in the esophagus. So hopefully that opens things up for a little bit for some people that you can have your may contain products. So I said before that, sometimes words are written as something a little bit different, and it is always written in the normal word that we know. So milk, egg, wheat, soya, peanut or fish, but it also might be listed in other words. And actually out of the UK, you're probably more likely to see some of these words listed on labels. So it's always worth having, this information handy, just so you're aware that, milk might be written as casein or whey, and soya might be written as soya grits or vegetable protein. And I suppose with vegetable protein, if it doesn't specifically say it doesn't contain soya, I probably would avoid it. Again, I've written here modifiable edible starch and thickener with a little asterisk next to it. And again, if it doesn't specify that they don't contain wheat or, for example, it's a corn-based thickener, then that would be fine. But if you're unsure, then probably I would avoid it. until you're able to speak to, you know, a dietitian or someone who might be able to support you a bit further with that. I mean, nuts and peanut are normally quite obvious, but peanuts particularly, and some of the tree nuts, do have some different names depending on where you are in the world. So it's always worth just knowing some of those names if you're traveling afar. You know, nuts can be confusing because coconut, for example, is not a nut, but it has nut in the name. The same with chestnut, that isn't a nut, but it has nut in the name. So it's always worth just having this list kind of handy or on the back of your mind if you're not sure. And fish and shellfish, I mean, they're the easy ones. They're normally just labeled as cod or salmon or tuna or whatever the fish is in the ingredient. But I have put some kind of unusual suspects down. So there are some things that, you know, we'd think, oh, they definitely don't contain any of these allergens. You know, we don't need to worry. So Worcestershire sauce actually contains anchovy, so that contains fish. Chewits contain egg powder, the same with royal icing. Some sausages contain, not all of them, but some of them contain wheat, and actually some have some soya in them as well. And your OXO cubes or your I can't think of the word, stock cubes, they can contain some wheat as well, or gluten, so double check that. And then crisps randomly have, generally it's usually your milk protein that they contain, and it normally seems to be the chicken flavor or, you know, your beef flavor. I'm yet to find a beef flavor crisp that doesn't have some milk protein in. So if anyone has one, then that'd be great for me to know that as well. So checking some of those things is also really, really important that you might not think about. Okay, so eating out, I mean, it's not at the moment, but it is on the horizon. Hopefully come the end of March, beginning of April, we'll be able to go out again, go to a restaurant, even if we're sitting outside. So there are some kind of top tips around eating out, but it is really being as diligent as you can. So lots of the big chain restaurants have nutritional information and ingredient information available on their website. So it's always worth just checking those websites. And sometimes it might be easier to go to a chain restaurant where there may be more set up for reducing cross-contamination and things, rather than sort of smaller family-run restaurants. It can be really helpful to ring ahead and just say, you know, my child is on a 6 food exclusion diet, which means they don't eat X, Y, Z. You know, is there something that could be accommodated on the menu, or is there something we could discuss before we arrive? It's worth speaking with your waiter or waitress, or it might be speaking to the head of service, because, you know, they might not have that knowledge, but someone maybe a little bit higher up in the on the restaurant floor might have a little bit more knowledge and be able to help you once you arrive in the restaurant. They tried to keep to simple foods on the menu. So this would be things like, you know, rice, but double checking they don't put any butter in the rice, which often they do. It might be sort of plain meats and fishes, or, you know, like a lentil or bean-based curry, for example. But that's where you really want to kind of have a check on the website, or speak to the chef, for example, because they might add some cream into that, some butter into that, use ghee in cooking. So there's loads of different ways that these things can be as part of the diet to enhance flavour, but actually could easily be avoided if they're cooking from scratch. And thinking about sort of your hidden sources of some of these foods, so that tends to be your gravies, your sauces, thickening agents used in cooking. I mean, self-service areas are not really a thing anymore, and I suspect they're not going to be for quite a long time, but there is a higher risk of cross-contamination in self-service areas. So someone dipping a spoon into you know, some chips that have been cooked in something which contains gluten, but then also sticking it in the rice, and you're dishing up the rice. So you know, it's important, if you are going to self-service areas, be confident that, you know, they are able to cater for food exclusions, and those things are maybe kept separate on the self-service areas. And if you're in doubt and you're really not sure, you know, if they're able to accommodate these dietary changes, then I'd advise to go somewhere else. or have a look on some of the forums, etc. They might have some really helpful tips from other families who are following these diets. Okay, so travel tips. Hopefully we'll be off on holiday soon enough. But one of the key things to think about if you're traveling somewhere else where English is not the first language is actually learning to translate those key foods that they're avoiding into the local language. I don't pretend to speak any other languages, so I won't give you any examples, but if anyone else can speak French or Spanish, please feel free to share. If you're flying long haul, have a chat with the airline before you go, whether they can accommodate what your child's dietary needs are. If your child was on an elemental diet, for example, or they did have a specialised formula to support their nutrition, your dietitian or your paediatrician or gastroenterologist can actually write an airline letter for you to be able to take that directly onto the plane. So that's always worth asking about if you're concerned that you're going a long way and there's not going to be enough nutrition on the trip for your child. Taking snacks as much as possible, or homemade sandwiches that aren't going to go off after being in the lunchbox for however many hours, is a good way to make sure your child's got something that they normally like to eat, and make sure that they've got a substantial meal whilst they're on the plane. And then when you get on holiday, have a look on TripAdvisor about local restaurants, and actually, if anyone's mentioned that allergy can be catered for in these places, or if it can't. And actually sometimes booking into sort of a self-catering accommodation can be preferable if your child's on a really exclusive diet, because then you have just a bit more flexibility to be able to buy those foods and cook those foods yourself at home before going out enjoying your holiday for the rest of the evening or for the day. So kitchen tips. So we want to make sure that the food we produce at home is free from whatever foods your child's having to avoid, whether that's the 2 food, the 4 food, or the 6 food. So some of it just comes down to kind of your basic food preparation principles. So making sure that you're wiping down your surfaces with your antibacterial spray, you're cleaning your pots and pans with warm soapy water. You can use your standard washing up liquid, and your standard dishwasher tabs, doesn't need to be anything special. And you don't need to kind of wash your child's foods bowls first and then yours, or vice versa. It can all go in the sink together or in the dishwasher together, as long as you've got that cleaning agent in there and the warm salty water. Cross-contamination is basically when say particles or crumbs, etc., of a food gets onto something that we don't want it to be on. So sort of wheat or gluten is probably one of the easiest ones to think about. If we think we put a slice of free from bread in the toaster, but in the other slot we put a normal bit of bread, it's likely that those crumbs are going to kind of get onto the gluten-free bread. So it can be helpful to have a separate toaster if that's something that kind of is part of your child's diet regularly. You can buy little toasty bags, but you can pop the bread into as well and put it in your family toaster. You could just do it under the grill if you didn't want to buy 2 separate things. One of the big culprits is kind of your spreads and your jams and all those types of things, where you stick it in one, butter the toast, and then you put it in the next one. And actually you want to avoid that. So either having separate colour handles on your knives, for example, to use the free from products, or taking a little bit out with a spoon and then putting it on the toast with the knife. If you're cooking a family meal, I mean, most families will probably adopt a lot of the dietary changes as a family whole, just as a support network. But if you have another child that really doesn't like your gluten-free pasta, for example, it's important to make sure you have separate chopping boards and separate utensils when cooking. And actually, I find kind of having different colours for different things can be really helpful, just to keep things separate in the kitchen. If you can store things in the original packet, that's really helpful. Or if you decant things into glass jars or plastic tubs, etc., making sure it's clearly labelled as, you know, free from X, Y, and Z. So there's no chance that you accidentally grab the wrong thing from the shelf, and then your child's eating normal oats when they should be having, you know, your pure oats or your gluten-free oats. And then thinking about the pandemic, and this was something, I mean, it's probably not quite so much of an issue now, but when the first wave of the pandemic hit, there was a real problem with families being able to get access to the specialised products, so the free from products, because people had either kind of stockpiled these, so there was nothing on the shelf, or they were limited to the amount that they were allowed to buy, when actually normally it was kind of quite a substantial part of the child's diet. So one of the key things, I suppose, now in the pandemic is really making sure that we're meal planning and preparation. So we kind of know exactly quantities we need of these things, so we're not going to run out, or, you know, we're not going to overbuy to mean that another family can't have what they need as well. It's important to use some of those naturally free from products in cases like this. So rather than having, you know, your specialized wheat-free products, it might be rice or potato or sweet potato or quinoa that could be used as an alternative. I'm thinking of those in different forms. So it might be making potato gnocchi, for example, rather than just mashing it, or, you know, just boiling it, or roasting. You can make, you know, little rice, like fried rice cakes, or flavoring it with coconut flakes to change the flavor. Again, you can make little potato rosties, etc., like that, just to change up those foods if that's the only thing you can get hold of. And if you are lucky enough to get an online slot, trying to pre-book those slots. If you have other family members that do shopping separately to you, so maybe grandparents or aunties and uncles, whether they could add, you know, two packets of the specialized plant-based milk that you normally use to their shopping list as well, so that you can make sure that you've got some on someone's shopping list. And think about some of the local independent shops and some of the, you know, the farm shops that might be close to you, or even some of the corner shops actually have quite a lot of these products now available. So it's always worth checking out those if you're not able to get it in maybe your mainstream supermarkets. And if you're unable to get kind of your calcium fortified products, which normally you rely on for your child's calcium intake, is actually thinking about whether at that point it would be helpful to start an over-the-counter calcium supplement or general multivitamin, just to make sure they are getting what they need until you're able to kind of get them back onto their usual exclusion diet. And actually speak with your dietitian. So the BDA, the British Dietetic Association, did set up in the first pandemic kind of a standardized letter that dietitians could use for patients who are really struggling to get hold of some of these products. And this allowed them to be kind of a priority customer at the supermarket, so they could go in the priority times, you know, earlier in the day or later in the evening, and skip the queues, etc. So it's always worth speaking to your dietitian, because they might be able to help. And then finally, if we think about kind of food reintroduction, so your child's been on the exclusion diet for, you know, 8 to 12 weeks, as Karen explained previously. We use that as a time frame before we kind of think about what the next step would be. What's important to do before you bring any of these foods back into the diet is to have a discussion with your gastroenterologist and dietitian, or your MDT who support you with EoE. And that's just because once we've made a change, so whether that's dietary or whether that's medication for treatment of EoE, we actually want to have a look with the camera. So we do another scope to see what's happened to the disease, to the eosinophil count. So to understand if this has reduced on the elimination diet, and if it's in remission. And if it's not, if you're on the 2-food diet, we might discuss what the next step be, whether that would be the 4th food or the 6th food, or you might want to opt for a medical treatment at that point. But when you do the food reintroduction, your dietitian will be able to support you with that. And, you know, there's a couple of different approaches that we use with reintroduction. And that kind of depends on how long you've been excluding that food, and actually if there's potentially another non-IgE mediated allergy alongside that. So we might do reintroduction using a ladder format, which gradually builds up the amount of protein that's in the diet until you get to a normal age appropriate portion. Or we might just introduce it in a pure form. So we might say, yeah, sure, you can just have soya again. Let's just bring that back in all forms to the diet and see how you manage. After that food is reintroduced, most centres, not all centres, would like to keep that in, for your 8 to 12 weeks, and then actually do another scope to see if the eosinophil count has changed. And that would show us if the eosinophil count had come out of remission, that food is potentially one of the trigger foods for EoE. So we'd remove it again and then put another food back in. In terms of allergy testing around reintroduction, so there's not really a need for allergy testing unless the child has been on a really prolonged food exclusion. And we know that there can be a risk of converting from a non-IgE mediated allergy, which EoE is, to an immediate allergy following a prolonged period of exclusion, especially in atopic individuals. So people with eczema or asthma, hay fever, etc., they can be at higher risk of converting, especially after a prolonged exclusion. So that's another reason why you should be having a chat with your gastroenterologist, your allergist, and your dietitian before the reintroduction, because we'd want to make sure that they were done in a safe place, whether that be at home or whether an oral food challenge was needed in hospital. And then once it's introduced, if, fingers crossed, eosinophil counts remain low, then that can be included as part of the diet and should be kept in the diet regularly as part of the family normal diet. Oh, and finally, I thought that was my last slide, but this is my last slide. So just some useful resources that I thought might be helpful for you guys. So I don't know if anyone uses or has used or heard of the Food Maestro app. So this is a really great app that has a filter on it, so you can put in which foods your child excludes. So you could, put in the full 6 food or the full MUSE, so milk, egg, wheat, soya. What I would say with the Food Maestro app is that you need to make sure that you are removing the may contain button on the filter, because otherwise it doesn't give you hardly any options, and we know that that's not a problem in EoE. So definitely untick the may contain, because we don't need to worry about avoiding that. Spoon Guru is very similar to that food, so you put in your allergens and then you can search under breads, under cereals, under biscuits, under whatever it is that you're looking for, and that will show you with a little smiley face what's suitable. They've also both got barcode scanners on, so if you're in a shop and you're rushed for time, you could just scan the barcode and it would tell you if it was suitable or not. You've also got the BDA Food Allergy Specialist Group. They have some really great resources on there that your dietitian should have access to if they are a member of that specialist group, which I'm sure they'd be able to share with you. And they've got loads of really good information, so that's another great one. And then there's some websites here that can be really helpful. And this is just, I suppose, loads of different ones. You've got your Vegan Society, so that would be anything that's free from milk and egg. You've got Celiac UK, so that would be excluding wheat and gluten products. You've got your Yellow Cross card, which is helpful when you're traveling abroad. So have a look at all of these if you've not had a chance to, up until now. It's got some really useful information that can be great when managing these diets. And then obviously the EOS network. So these webinars that we've been recording are going to be available for anyone to have a look at as and when they need it. And obviously, the team over at the EOS network are very approachable and happy to answer questions or to divert those questions to any health professionals that they know will be able to support you. And thank you.
What I'm going to do is I'm going to give you a couple of quick, brief questions, and then I'm going to drop over to Alex very briefly to do a short poll to give us an idea of who we've got in the audience before we split into our breakout rooms. I think it'd be really nice then to give an opportunity for both of you to spend a bit of time with some of the community members that have joined us this evening. So a couple of the quick general questions that came up was asking about the nutritional yeast, First of all, does that have gluten in it, or do you have to be careful which products? Is there lots of products on the market?
So there's not loads on the market, well, here in the UK anyway, as far as I'm aware. I think there's only a couple. I think you have to just double check with the gluten. In terms of EoE, we're not necessarily avoiding gluten, so in most cases it would be fine. But it's always just double checking that on, on the app or, the label, if you're not sure. So yeah.
Brilliant. The other quick question, which I think again is probably going to be a similar answer. Does wheat-free bakery products not often contain egg? I'm thinking they're probably thinking about the free-from products on the shelf.
So often they do contain egg, unfortunately. Yeah. That is the one that seems to be in a lot of the free-from products and can be quite difficult. And that's where some of those ideas around using your flax egg or your mashed bananas, or the aqua, I've forgotten how to say it now, the chickpea water, as an alternative in home cooking, can be really helpful. I know it's maybe not quite as convenient to grab things off the shelf, but it can be quite difficult to find the shop bought things. Or having a look at if you've got a vegan bakery locally to you, often they will have, your vegan, they won't have any egg or milk in, and often they will make a gluten-free product as well. So sometimes going to some of the smaller independent bakeries might be a good way to find it if you can't get it in your big supermarket.
I think that the bakery products are one of the most difficult things to find.
Yeah.
Yeah, you have to. We've got a couple of bakery recipes on our website. I think a lot of the time it's about baking your own. Is once you get your head around doing that, especially biscuits and things like that and flapjacks, and then at least you know what's gone in them. My experiences with the free-from products, a lot of the bakery stuff, it doesn't taste quite as good as it looks on the packet, and B, it often has got a load of other stuff in it besides it, which makes it quite tricky. And you can bake some really simple, completely free-from. There's biscuits we make with literally 3 ingredients. And the kids love them. They're still eating them, so they've had them for years. It's just finding those secret recipes. So I'm going to give you a chance to get your breath back, Lucy, while Alex does a quick poll.